Ah, Windows 7. I've always liked Windows 7. It's brilliant. But the bad news is that in January of next year, Microsoft are going to cut support for it. The information for that is available on their website. And if we look at this page that I've saved, after January the 14th, 2020, Microsoft will no longer provide security updates or support for PCs running Windows 7. Not entirely true, because certain organisations that use it can actually pay for extended support. Voting machines is one, large corporations that rely on it are another, but the cost of that will escalate very rapidly, and it's only for businesses, not for home users. And it's generally for a corporate environment, not for small businesses. So what this video is about is your options for preparing for that and what to do when it happens, because it is going to happen. But first, I want to discuss a few key business principles. One is that with computers, it's not the fact that something's new that's the problem. It's familiarity and change. People don't like change. So if you're looking to ditch Windows 7 completely and go for Windows 10, if you weren't afraid of the changes that might bring, you'd have done it already. So a lot of people are afraid to get Windows 10 because they think it's different. More on that later. The other thing is that the way I work is the most cost-effective solution is the best one. It's not always the cheapest, but it's going to be the best one to go with. Now, what I tend to think about when I'm dealing with customers is the final thing I want to say about the way I do business, and that is best described like this. No one knowingly makes a wrong decision, unless they're an idiot, which people aren't generally. So I'd wondered why people make wrong decisions, and the answer to that is because when they're presented with the options they have to choose from by an expert or a professional, then if the answer that ultimately turns out to be the right answer isn't there at the time the choice is made, then they make a bad decision. A good example of that is a well-known high street retailer of computers is running adverts which basically say, if you're fed up with your old laptop and it's running slowly and it's frustrating and it's then they say, just buy a new one. That will solve it. That's not presenting people with all the available options. That's not presenting people with all the information they need to make an informed choice and therefore make the correct choice. So what I tend to do is look at the situation and say all the possible choices, and then the customer can then choose the one they want, or they can trust me to do it for them. The thing is that making the right choice is only possible if that's one of the options, and that's kind of the way I work. So if you're still watching, here's my take on Windows 7. Okay, in December, some historical perspective, in December 2018, I've got my notes here, in December 2018, Windows 10 for the first time overtook Windows 7 for market share. There was 39.22% market share for Windows 10 and 36.9% for Windows 7. So for the first time, there were more Windows 10 installations than Windows 7. That was 3.5 years after Windows 10 was first made available. So there's an awful lot of Windows 7 machines still out there. An awful lot. If you've bought an ex-business laptop, it will probably have Windows 7 Pro on it if it doesn't have Windows 10. If you've bought anything that's ex-businessy, it will have Windows 7 Pro on it. You may still have a computer that works that's got Windows 7 on it anyway. You may have Windows 7 was available even after Windows 10 was released in retail outlets. You just said, I don't want Windows 10, and they brought the ones with Windows 7 on out. So Windows 7 is available. You can still buy it. Business tended to use it because it integrated with their existing systems, whereas Windows 8 and Windows 10 took a bit of time to get, well, Windows 8 didn't really get settled in at all, but Windows 10 has taken a bit of time to get itself sorted out. But for home users, Windows 10 on any new machine has been around for a while. Windows 7 not so much. But like I say, if you bought an ex-business laptop from somebody, then I suspect it will have Windows 7 Pro on it, because a lot of business laptops were specified with that. More on that later though, because that might be kind of interesting a bit later in terms of how much things are going to cost. So what does that date mean? And what are your choices? Well, after the 14th of January, Microsoft will no longer provide security updates or support. The key thing to that is security updates. If a vulnerability in the operating system is discovered after that date, Microsoft will not patch it. They will not fix it. And there have been quite a lot of updates involving security. And you can just look at your Windows Update history and it will tell you. And the way you do that is by going to Start, Control Panel, System and Security, and then Windows Update. This one is obviously updated, but we can go to View Update History, and you can see there's a Security Intelligence update, there's a security update for .NET Framework, security, everything's security. Now, some of these aren't Windows, some of these are other things apart from Windows, which is another interesting point. But nonetheless, most of the updates are security based. So does that mean that after the 14th you become more vulnerable? And the answer is yes, but the police don't arrest and imprison everybody that owns a classic car because they're at risk and they're vulnerable. Do they? So why is that? Well, they probably should, because, you know, classic cars have incredibly dodgy safety features. They don't have airbags usually. Some of them don't have seat belts. The Mini, for example, the classic Mini has a protruding petrol cap, which even in a low impact collision can often be sheared off, spilling petrol everywhere, and it's right next to the rear headlights, well, not headlights, the rear lights, and there's a source of ignition. So there have been a lot of fire injuries involving those vehicles. The seat is tilted forward on a little hinge and it isn't anchored down, so you get a lot of injuries, even at low speed, where the rear passenger would crush the driver, and on and on and on and on and on. I can go on for ages about Minis. But people still drive them. There's a club for them, and they're quite funky and they're pretty cool, let's be honest. But no one picks on them for having those cars, do they? So why is that relevant? Well, if you use Windows 7 a bit like people use a classic car, I'm not saying just at the weekends, but if you do certain things with it, then you can carry on using it. Because it's going to be fine. If you check your emails using a client like Outlook or Thunderbird, that's fine. If you use a web browser to browse the internet like Chrome or Firefox, then that's also fine. They are updated. They have support for Windows 7, and there's no indication yet as to when they're going to pull support. But for Windows XP, I'll check my notes, Firefox dropped support On June 2018 for XP and Vista, bearing in mind that Microsoft killed XP off allegedly in 2014, and Chrome dropped it 2016. They dropped XP 2016. So a good few years after the official end of XP, people were still using Chrome to browse the internet perfectly happily and perfectly securely. Of course, the difference here is that if you certain activities on the internet do expose you more to threats. The main one is looking for things that you know aren't free for free. So if you try and look for stuff that you know isn't free and you want to get it free, that act of looking can often give you a nice little list of sites to click on, and a lot of them are what I call, well, they're called honeypot sites, where they draw you in, get you to install something, and there's the virus. Also, you can get infected by rogue email attachments and things like that. This isn't a video about how to stop yourself getting infected by viruses or what to do about virus protection, although I might do another one about that if you want me to. But the more recklessly you drive in your car, the more likely you are to crash it. And if you're in a classic car, that's going to hurt a lot more than if you're in a modern car. But if all you do is take it out at the weekends and drive about with the roof down when the sun's out, you're probably going to be okay, aren't you, really? Can't guarantee it, but the risk is dropped very, very significantly. And of course, if you retrofit it with safety devices, then it makes it even better. So if you use a web browser that is updated for security threats, like Chrome and Firefox, then you're fine. The original Windows 7 came with Internet Explorer 8. If you try and use that on the net, all hell breaks loose. But a fully updated version of Windows 7 uses Internet Explorer 11, which actually comes with Windows 10, because Microsoft Edge uses Internet Explorer 11 for its compatibility features. So although Microsoft are going to drop support for Windows, they may continue updating Internet Explorer 11, which is another thing. What actually stops on January the 14th? Well, security updates or support for PCs. The support bit means you can't ring them and ask for help. They'll just say nope unless you pay them. The security updates is specifically for security updates. It doesn't necessarily apply to other things, like, for example, the web browser or .NET or some of the other things, or Office, some of the other things that also get updated via Windows Update. So for this machine here, well, it's a virtual machine. This actually is fully updated. Most of the updates are security. Those security updates will stop. But if you browse the web using Chrome or Firefox, and you only go to certain sites, like for your shopping or for the BBC, for the news, or for Facebook, although more on that in a minute, then you're probably going to be okay. If you check your emails using a web browser, you're going to be okay. If you check your emails using a client like Outlook or Thunderbird, then you're going to be okay, because the threats that come via that are a separate issue. I'm going to go back to Facebook now, because Facebook runs third-party adverts. So if you frequent a website that uses a lot of third-party adverts, there is a chance that there's an exploit there. What third-party adverts do is what all websites can do is they can query the browser for information like what operating system you're using, what screen resolution you're using, what browser you're using. That data collection is automatic, and it can be used for sinister purposes, but generally it helps people design websites because they know what the screen size is on average, they know what the operating system is on average, and they can look at making their things work better. But nonetheless, that information is collected, and if a third-party advert, which anyone can put on Facebook, is put on Facebook, that can scan, detect that you're using Internet Explorer 11, or detect that your operating system is Windows 7, and then if an exploit is known and not patched, which it won't be after January, exploit it. So if you do a lot of Facebook on your computer, that's a bit dodge, potentially. The risk is still, I mean, Facebook don't, well, they do have rogue adverts, but they are generally pretty, well, I hope, pretty sharp about doing it. So you can carry on using it. That's the cheapest option. Just do nothing, except maybe change your web browser. So that's the first option. Carry on using it. You just make sure that you're like a classic car, that your activities are limited to a very particular set of things, and that you may consider changing your browser to Chrome or Firefox if you don't already use that, and you'll be fine. I don't see any reason why there's a problem with that. Obviously, at some point in the future, you're going to have to bite the bullet a bit and do something, but that might be dictated by the PC breaking rather than being forced into it because Microsoft's dropping support. So if your computer is working fine and you use Windows 7 for quite a limited range of activities, carry on using it. So that's the first option. The second option would be to upgrade it. Now, upgrading it is an interesting one. Before I start talking about that, I'm going to say that some of my customers have got Windows XP. They're still using Windows XP. And that's because milestone end-of-life announcements like the support for Windows 7 is... some businesses see that as an opportunity, and that's an opportunity to make more business. And the way they do that is very simple. They make sure that certain models of their product don't have Windows 10 drivers. So I've got customers that have got very large plotters, I've got customers that have got metal etching machines, and they use Windows XP because the one they've got isn't supported by Windows 10. You can buy these things second hand off eBay and things like that for not much money, and it does exactly the same job as a new one, which would cost you maybe 10 grand. So it can be quite an expensive thing. So a lot of companies are going to see this as an opportunity to get people to buy new versions of their products. So if you've got a specialist piece of kit, like a specialist printer or plotter or mechanical thing that etches or whatever, that might not be supported by Windows 10, and you might have to buy the newest or singing or dancing version. So that's another reason for sticking with Windows 7 or Windows XP in cases of some of my customers. So with if that applies to you, then obviously that's a thing that's going to be quite significant and a really good reason for sticking with Windows 7. Obviously, if you're worried about the internet and things like that, because that's where most of the threats come from, then you just unplug it from the internet. That's it. Simple as that. Here's an XP machine that does that. It sits in the corner, and when they want to etch a bit of metal, they use it. I think that was about 300 or 400 quid they bought that for. A new one's about 10 grand. The actual funky bits under the box on the right. So that is an important consideration for businesses. Home users, not so much. But yeah, be aware that this might be an opportunity for some companies to, stitch you up basically. So that takes care of the carrying on using it bit. Let's do the upgrade bit now. What are your upgrade options? Well, the upgrade options are depending on what version of Windows you've got already. So let's find out how we determine that. If you click Start and then move the mouse over to Computer and right click on it, you can bring up properties like that. And you can see this machine is, it's got 4 gig of RAM, it's Core i7, that's the host machine, this is actually a virtual machine. It's 64-bit version of Windows 7 and it's activated, so it's all legal and legit. It's also Service Pack 1. The Windows Experience Index is 1, but we'll come back to that. So that's how we know what version we've got. This is professional, so we would be looking to upgrade to professional. Prepare yourself for a shock. If you do it via Microsoft, it will cost you £220, which is ridiculous because it used to be cheaper than that, quite a lot cheaper than that in fact. But don't worry, you can get it a lot cheaper than that, under 100 quid in fact. The actual requirements are where it gets kind of interesting because they've changed these. The requirements currently are a 1 gigahertz or faster compatible processor, 1 gig of RAM or 2 gig for 64-bit, 20 gig space, 800 by 600 screen resolution, internet access, and it won't play DVDs, but you knew it wouldn't anyway. That's why you get Power DVD supplied with it, because Microsoft didn't want to pay for the codec to be installed, because they worked out that only about 5% of people actually watch DVDs on their computer, so they didn't think it was worth it, because obviously it would increase the price of Windows. But, well, 1 gigahertz processor, that's every processor pretty much since the year 2000, because in 2000 AMD pipped Intel to the post and they produced a 1 gigahertz processor, the first one. So that's a nonsense. 1 gig of RAM, oh no, 2 gig of RAM. The thing here is that it used to say dual core. It used to say 1 gigahertz or faster dual core processor, but they've changed that. And it also used to start at 2 gig as well, not 1 gig. So they've made a few alterations to that. The specs for Home and Pro are very similar, by the way. If you want to know how many cores, because I just said the word core, then the way you do that is you right click on the desktop taskbar at the bottom and select Start Task Manager. And I'll bring that into perspective and I'll shrink these down so we get a clearer view. And that is Task Manager. So right click, select Task Manager. You'll see there's 2 graphs under CPU usage history. That means this machine has got 2 cores. That for hyperthreading as well, it would show up as being a separate graph. So hyperthreading, remember, is where Windows pretends to have a physical core. So this has got 2 cores. If it had hyperthreading, it would have 4 there. So this is just a 2-core machine. That's because I've limited the virtual machine to 2. So you can see the graph is plotting away. So if you see 1 graph there, you've got single core. If you see 6 graphs there, you've got 6 cores. Again, it also says how much RAM, and this one says it's got 4 gig. And this machine is just booted up, it's got nothing running, and it's got nearly 3 free. Which would suggest to me that having 1 gig is a really bad idea, because this is almost using 1 gig anyway, and it's not doing anything. So 1 gig, no, that would be awful. 2 gig is doable. So if your machine is dual core with 2 gig, then Windows 10 will work on it. What would be a good idea, however, is if you look at your hard drive, the actual hard drive here, it's a 40 gig virtual one, but it's on an SSD, so it's extremely quick. If your hard disk is mechanical, then swapping that out for an SSD might be a good idea, but more on that later. So in terms of upgrade, if your machine has got 2 cores and it's 1 gigahertz with 4 gig of RAM, you're going to be, it'll do it. It should be okay. That's pretty much every computer, really. Like I say, Microsoft have changed the specs. I mentioned at the start that one of the principles I work on is a consideration of change. And you're probably thinking, oh, Windows 10, I don't want to upgrade to that because it's different. If what you do involves the taskbar, which is this thing at the bottom here, and desktop icons, which this machine doesn't actually have any, then your experience of Windows 10 will be exactly the same as your experience of Windows 7. You'll double click the desktop, you'll double click on the taskbar, and you'll go about your business. The main thing that's different is actually the start menu. So what I've noticed is that some people who look at Windows 7 like going start documents. They like doing that. You can still do that. You can do that on Windows 10. There are ways to do that. You can also get software like Start Is Back, for example, that converts the Windows 10 start menu into one that's very much like the Windows 7 one. So again, the familiarity thing can be completely taken care of. Either you don't notice it because you use desktop and taskbar stuff, or you can make the start menu what it is, what it was. So familiarity is no longer an issue. So upgrading is actually probably not a bad idea. Now, if you want to do that properly, then a good idea would probably be to swap out your hard drive for a solid state drive. That's relatively simple if your machine's working, because your existing drive can be cloned directly onto it, so no need to reinstall. And then the upgrade can be performed. And then you've got your old drive in a drawer as like a backup anyway, just in case you're worried about losing data. You can also put an SSD in and do a completely fresh install, which might actually be a better idea in terms of performance, because over usage, the machine, your Windows installation is going to get really clogged up with stuff anyway. Also, if you perform the upgrade using the Microsoft Upgrade tool, then that will actually do a system scan before you do it to check for any known incompatibilities. And then if you're happy, you can then actually proceed. So that's quite a handy little tool to run to see if there is any issues that you may not have been aware of. Because everyone's got a bit of software that they use, but they might not have got the disk for it, or they might not realize how much they use it until it's not there. And that's part of this change thing. So, well, an SSD also is a good idea because they're typically orders of magnitude faster, usually 10 times faster. So a mechanical drive will do about 60 megabytes a second, an SSD will do about 400. So the actual speed difference is remarkable. But going back to cars, if you've never driven a Ferrari, you don't know how good they are compared to, I don't know, a Nissan Micra. And ultimately, the Ferrari and the Nissan Micra are still in the same traffic jam anyway. But if you have driven something a bit funky, then going back to something that isn't is it's a bit noticeable. It's like if you're used to having a big screen and you suddenly get a smaller one, you notice that as well. So although having an SSD in a Windows 10 machine is a great idea, if you're upgrading a Windows 7 machine and you're used to Windows 7 performance on that machine, then the Windows 10 performance won't be that different if you meet the minimum requirements that I've mentioned, dual core CPU, 4 gig of RAM. Then it will be very similar. Also, there are various things you can do to tweak performance and make it work better anyway. That isn't the purpose of this video. This is to give you options about what you want to do with Windows 7. It's not about anything else. But Windows can be optimized quite successfully and made to go an awful lot faster without the need to purchase anything. That's how you tell what your specification is. And when you compare that to the Microsoft one, it turns out any machine is upgradable. But in reality, based on my experience, you need at least a dual core processor and at least 4 gig of RAM for it to be anywhere near pleasurable. Also, in terms of upgrades, there may be issues with certain devices on the computer. This applies to laptops. Some of the wireless adapters are known to have problems. There is one Dell laptop, I can't remember the exact model, that will not upgrade to Windows 10 at all. It's one particular model, one of the Inspiron ones, I can't remember the exact one, but it will not and cannot be upgraded to Windows 10 ever for some reason. That's only one. The rest of them have got, generally, the ones I've upgraded to Windows 10 have been successful, apart from that one Dell laptop I mentioned. And all work fine. Some of them do have issues with their wireless cards, but that's usually rectifiable. It's just a question of whether you run the update and it works perfectly first time, or whether you run the update and it has problems that need fixing to make it work. Those are two different things. But generally speaking, upgrading a Windows 7 machine to Windows 10 is generally pretty painless. So the upgrade is quite a useful route. You wouldn't need to buy a new machine. You wouldn't need to change anything because you can do the upgrade in situ, although I would back everything up before you do it. You wouldn't need to dig out the disks for the software that you can't find anymore, because that should just get ported straight over, provided that it is compatible with Windows 10. Remember the business opportunity that some companies might take advantage of. And some companies did actually deliberately kill older versions of software, and when you try to install it on Windows 10 it will just say nope, or it would just violently crash. So that's a bit, yeah, that's a bit devious, isn't it, really? A bit naughty, but nonetheless they did it, so we can't really complain about that. So the final option then is just buy a new computer. There's always that one. But if you've got a machine that works, it seems a bit of a shame to bin it, doesn't it? Well, I think so. So yeah, so like and subscribe if you thought this video was helpful. There is a, I'll do a summary now. So on next January, security updates will stop. Windows 7 will keep working. Installations and activations after that date will still happen. If Windows XP ain't to go by, if you reinstall Windows 7 after that date, it will update automatically. It won't get anything new. They will turn the update servers off at some point, but not for Windows 7, because remember there's still quite a large user base for it. So carrying on using it is a viable option, despite what certain high street retailers would suggest. Upgrade is also an option. There are various factors around that, but generally that's the next cheapest. Buying a new computer is the final option. If you have any particular questions, then just put them in the comments and I'll answer them. The advice I've given here is free. It's to try and get you to think about making informed decisions about what to do when Windows 7 finally ends. It will be a sad day because I really like Windows 7, and I know a lot of people that do still really like it. But Windows 10 is the way forward, and you're not going to get in the way of that juggernaut, because you're going to get squished if you do. So yeah, any thoughts about this, stick them in the comments, like and subscribe, and thanks for watching.